I'm delighted to welcome you all in the name of Swiss Future for this last Impulse lecture of the year with Ronny Patz. I'm Isabelle Viong, a member of the board of Swiss Future. And before introducing Ronny Patz, I'd like to give the word quickly to my colleague from Swiss Future, Georges T. Rose, so that he also says hello to everyone.
Hello, everyone. I don't have to say very much. I'm very happy that we have Ronny Patz with us. And Isabelle, thank you, Isabelle, for organizing this session. And I'm looking very much forward to get some insights.
Thank you, George. So I'm really delighted to welcome Dr. Ronny Patz to this today lecture around the future of the United Nations between ruins and reform. This is perhaps the occasion to say that this is part of a Swiss Future focus on Geneva International, a focus that has been meaning that we've been organizing different activities, among which an applied research projects with master students in international relations at the Geneva Graduate Institute. And so I'm happy to mention that the 4 master students are here with us, Abigail, Bronwyn, Isabel, and Marilyn. And if I'm not wrong, we should have also with us, though I think they haven't come yet, perhaps some teaching assistant and faculty lead of the Geneva Graduate Institute if they come at some later point. So in his intervention, Ronny Patz will provide us insights into the diversity of funding models of some of the UN agencies, as well as the UN system per se, and the various financial and liquidity crises that they face now. Dr. Ronny Patz is a United Nations system analyst and author, expert in UN financing and governance. He's been studying and researching at Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, at Hertie School in Berlin, and at University of Potsdam, based on which he's been studying different Geneva-based global agencies, such as the World Health Organization, the International Labour Organization, the UN Refugee Agency, and the International Organization for Migration. And he has become a global voice following the current UN reforms and crises, unfortunately. And he's been sharing his insights on LinkedIn. So you can read him on LinkedIn, but if you don't have any LinkedIn, you can still read all of his blog posts on his blog. And I think that would be the moment when indeed Ronny can share his blog post. And I would like to finish before giving him the word by saying that I'd like to pay a special tribute not only to Ronny's expertise, but also to his generosity in sharing those insights. And if you want to help him to support his work, you can also contribute to his GoPro fund or GoFundMe, sorry. And I think that we can also indeed have the link here. And so now, without waiting further, I would like to give you the word. Ronny, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Isabelle, so much for having me. And let me start my presentation and share the screen. I hope you can all see the presentation. So the title of my presentation today is The Future of the United Nations Between Ruins and Reform. And as you will see and hear in the presentation, I'm gonna try to paint a larger picture of 100 years of ruins and reform, and to look into the future, because this is a talk for and with Swiss Future. So I'm gonna do something that political scientists don't like to do very much, to predict or to look into the future, because we are much better at predicting the past, so to say. But I'm gonna try this today, and obviously this is also meant to open the room for discussions, because by making choices to predict or to focus on certain things, I'm giving you room to contradict me or to add your own ideas as you like. As Isabel has already said, I have been doing research on the United Nations system, on budgeting, on financing, on resource mobilization. I've come to Geneva a couple of times to do interviews, to do archival work. I've been to Paris and New York and Jordan and Brussels to speak with people working in UN agencies for the last 10 years to understand how the UN system functions, how it works. And this was the basis for a decade. This was very academic knowledge, very ivory tower knowledge. And as this crisis emerged this year, I started writing on LinkedIn, as Isabel has already told you, almost on a daily basis. And through this writing, I got into contact with a lot of UN officials from around the world who not only asked me questions on details, but also who asked me about the future. And so I have become kind of forced to make not predictions, but at least to think about this future that the UN is facing in the short and long term. And so this is what I'm going to try today, link up the research perspective, the reform perspective, and the short term with the more longer term in my half-hour intervention. I want to focus on three futures today, given the time. The first future I want to focus on is the statement that, to the best of my analysis, I think the UN system will survive. And I will tell you, based on history, why I think this should be the case. The second future I will look into is to say that the UN crisis will not be over during 2026, but we will probably continue to be in this crisis mode for longer. And the third one, given that I talk with you at Swiss Future, I am gonna argue that Geneva's UN niche will further shrink, and I will tell you why this might be the case, and we can obviously discuss my points here. So let me dive into the presentation and the three futures in more detail first. The first future that I look into is the long-term survival of the agency, of the UN system, of the UN core. And the premise that I want to start off, and that's maybe a premise not so many people will start off when talking about the UN, is that I'm very much convinced that the United Nations was not born in 1945. It is not an 80-year-old patient, so to say. The United Nations was actually created in 1919. And the reason is that at its core, the UN and the UN system are a rebranded League of Nations and a rebranded League of Nations system. And I'm going to give you a few insights into why I think this and why this matters to predict the mid to long-term future of the agency. Let's look into an academic article from 1947, from the very first issue of the academic journal International Organization, one of the most prestigious academic journals still today, in an article called From League of Nations to United Nations by Leland M. Godrich. And let me read this to you, because not all of you may be able to read this. So he writes quite clearly, there was a hesitancy in many quarters to call attention to the essential continuity of the old League and the new United Nations for fear of arousing latent hostilities or creating doubts, which might seriously jeopardize the birth and early success of the new organization. And he continues, this silence regarding the League could well be understood at a time when the establishment of a general world organization to take the place of the discredited League was in doubt, when it was uncertain whether the United States Senate would agree to American participation, and when the future course of the Soviet Union was in balance. What this means is that all of the continuities that the League had were narratively hidden to tell the story of a new organization to basically address a problem that we are still facing today. US hesitancy to get involved in multilateralism, great power competition, and the role that different global powers at the time, the Soviet Union and the US, would play and how they would see multilateral organization. So what I'm saying here as a first starting point is that the birth of the UN is actually the survival of the League of Nations with a different narrative to keep the big powers in. That's the first kind of observation I want to make. The second observation is based on increasing research of last years and maybe the past decade for sure, of academics like exemplified here in this edited volume by Karen Graham Schildiger and colleagues on the history of international public administration from 1920 to the 1960s. Colleagues in history, in political science, showing how the organizational structures, the bureaucratic origins of the UN system and many other international organizations post-war are actually based in pre-war experiences, in organizational functions that have been built before the war. And for those of you who are not following the long history, the International Labour Organization obviously was created alongside the League of Nations and continues to exist until today. The League of Nations Health Organization was the core basis for the World Health Organization. And a lot of the structures that you see in the core UN today, the decision-making, the committees, many of these ideas are actually pre-war ideas. And so the survivability of the League is actually, pretty strong. And obviously, the physical representation of this is the Palais des Nations in Geneva that was built during the time of the League of Nations, but construction was only finished short before World War II. So actually, this building built for the League became one of the core buildings and assets of the United Nations after the war. And as many of you know and see, and if you are in Geneva, probably you have been there, this is a central point of global multilateralism, and it was built for this in this interwar period. So looking at the future, my argument is that as the core of the League of Nations system has survived even World War II, reborn as the UN system, and as the UN has survived the long East-West confrontation of the Cold War, and as it has survived the North and South divisions of the post-colonial era, this means, a bit boldly, whatever crisis the UN faces today, it will survive, with a little caveat, at least very likely, at least mid to long term. Nothing probably survives forever. But I think there is little belief that there is an immediate and midterm collapse of the UN system to expect. However, and this is the questions we need to ask today, is how will it survive and what will survive within the UN system? And here we get into much more muddy territory. Will the UN's development, multilateral development work survive? And if yes, will it survive just as a policy work, meaning that they will make recommendations and ideas and measure developments, or will they actually have the funding to support multilateral development work? Or will maybe all of this financial side shift to multilateral development banks that have much more money, much more leeway to push big development projects forward? Will multilateralism in the UN system look the same as it has looked for the past decades? Or will it maybe evolve into what Antonio Guterres, the current Secretary General, has called networked multilateralism in the future, meaning that the New York and Geneva multilateralism will link the changing alliances, regional, interregional, geopolitical alliances from the BRICS to the EU, from the G77 to ASEAN? Will it maybe link those discussions, but discussions will shift to a regional level much more than they have been so far? And the third question is, will the UN remain an operational global multilateral structure? Will it have the funding to sustain peacekeeping, to sustain big humanitarian actions, or will member states and donors retreat from this kind of costly interventionism? And this is really the question that are hard to answer easily in the short to midterm. This brings me to my second future, and this is the resolution and the question of how the current crisis can be and is addressed, and how it looks in the wider scheme of the history of the United Nations. My premise here is that the UN system's financial crisis of this year is clearly not the first major UN crisis of the history, even of the UN, even if we start in 1945. This is the history of the UN, when you read it, is basically a series of crises, and maybe the non-crisis years are more interesting to discover than the crisis years. And for those of you who hear the term liquidity crisis this year for the first time, so crisis emerging when countries like the USA don't pay their membership fees, their assessed contributions, and the UN has a budget, but not the money, the cash to actually implement the budget. This kind of liquidity crisis has been there in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, maybe not so much in the 2000s, but by the end of the 2010s, this has come back, and other UN agencies have had similar, if not that frequent, crises across their history. What I would like to highlight still as my second subpart of this premise, I still believe, from looking at the history as far as I can and as the data is available, this year's financial crisis looked like the fastest and largest shock in the history of the UN, and especially the wider UN system. And I think this shapes the prediction of how this shock will shape the future of the current system, at least in the short to midterm. And I'm going to talk about this in a second. So for those of you who are not into the nitty-gritty of the financial crisis, the UN system, and when I say UN system, I mean the core regular UN budget, the peacekeeping, the World Health Organization, all of the humanitarian work that World Food Program, UNICEF and others do, the development work that UNDP and others do. All of this is here in those figures of the UN system, which reached a kind of peak in 2023, 24. So at the long tail of COVID and the beginning of the Russian war in Ukraine. But from 2024 to 2025 and going into 26 now, we are facing a 25%, a quarter resource cut across the entire UN system. And if you imagine your local town, your country, your federal government cutting 25% of the budget within less than a year's time, you can imagine what challenges and chaos this would create at national level. And I think we have seen this year that this has been the case for the UN system itself. And so I think it's really important to understand that this year was a large shock. And this is important because the UN system depends to 20%, let's say, on so-called regular budgets that are adopted by all 190 plus member states every year or every second year, depending on the organization. And the rest of the funding of the UN system is so-called voluntary contributions, which mostly governments provide on top of their obligatory funding. And so what Donald Trump did when he came into office earlier this year, he basically cut the US contributions to some of the core budgets by saying, you know, those budgets are adopted, but I'm not paying those. But he also and his government cut a lot, if not the majority, of voluntary funding that the US was providing to the UN system. And this is how this massive overall cut happens. And it happened fast, in some cases within weeks. In some cases, there was a bit of a buffer, and it's still ongoing how the effects are playing out. But for example, the International Organization for Migration was hit very fast, very hard, being very dependent on US funding. But as I said before, it's not the first time that the US has been doing things like this. And I want to just focus on one period in the 80s that's maybe the most comparable to the present situation. So we are in the kind of Reagan era, also very critical to multilateralism, withholding funding to the UN, to UNESCO, criticizing WHO and the Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome. And because of this financial crisis that emerged from this, a high-level intergovernmental expert group was set up in the mid-80s to, and I quote, review the efficiency of the administrative and financial functioning of the United Nations. So, for those of you who follow the current crisis, this rings a lot of bells. And one of the recommendations that this group put out there, and I read for those who can't read it, they recommended that the overall number of regular budget posts of the UN should be reduced by 15% within a period of 3 years. So the 15% figure is exactly where we are at the core UN budget discussions at the moment, just with the difference that they recommended 3 years. Now we are in a 1-year kind of time frame in 2025. At the time, they also recommended that the number of regular budget posts at the level of Undersecretary General and Assistant Secretary General, so the 2 levels below the Secretary General of the UN, should be reduced by 25%, so higher than the average of the organization, something that UN staff this year have been complaining about, that the high-level posts are not cut enough, while the lower-level posts would be cut. So even in the 80s, you could read New York Times headlines like this one: UN is cutting back top staff positions, and similar discussions as we see today were voiced in the 80s. And I highlight this because obviously we can learn something from those periods, and we can also see how things evolved from there. I was at an event in Berlin on UN reform and retreat earlier this week, and Kira Kruglikova, the director of the Division of Administration of the UN office in Geneva, was streamed at the event. And she said, looking at the 80s and the cuts and reforms done then, they did not ruin the reform, the organization, but they cut it down and it grew back from there. But what she also said is that the memory of this time and how reforms were done is gone in the organization. So today looks like a completely new exercise because everybody who works there is new. One thing she didn't say, but that I would like to highlight from looking beyond the mid-80s, is those reforms and those cuts at the time did not actually improve the US's payment behavior afterwards, or for not very long for sure, which means that anybody who hopes that the current reforms and the current discussions will actually bring the Trump administration back and pay their contributions, if you just cut some corners here and do some reforms there, I would be very doubtful that this is happening based at least on historical experience. So let me predict, or let me point out the second future that I would like to focus on in this presentation. I'm very sure, and I see it already in the announcement, the shock of 25 will still echo in 26, because a lot of the staff cuts that have been decided now will also only become effective in the first half of 2026. The relocations from duty stations like New York or Geneva are only happening now to places like Nairobi, Bangkok, Rome, and other places. So there will be an immediate continuation of this year's shock, at least for the first half of next year, probably longer. I also don't think that the UNAIDS reforms that have been basically started as a reaction to this cutting down process, they will not solve the crisis. Those reforms, they maybe save 5, 6, 7%, but with cuts at 25 or higher percentages, there is still a lot going on that actually resembles a crisis and not just a pure reform. And I think because the realization of this crisis will only evolve across the year, I think member states will not completely realize before the fourth quarter of 2026 what has been destroyed this year and early next year across the UN system, which structures are gone, not financed anymore. And they will wake up, I think, late in the year to the realization what's there and what isn't. And so my expectation is that the consolidation of this new state of the UN system will really only start in 2027, building on, let's say, the ruins of this year. Also with a new Secretary General that will be selected in the course of 2026, thinking about maybe how to design the future UN system. But this will not be done before 27, 28. And given historical expectations, the crisis might also take a different turn over those 2-3 years. So this raises the question and brings me slowly to my third and last future perspective, is how will all this affect the UN's presence around the world in headquarter locations like New York and Geneva, and at the country level. We already see this year that functions are relocated from New York to Nairobi by UN Women, by UNFPA, by UNICEF. Some functions are relocated to Bonn, to Bangkok. So these things are happening right now. And in New York, entire buildings leases will end and they will close certain buildings, not obviously the iconic main building here on the picture, but other buildings are gonna be closed. At the country level, some of the cuts have already happened very fast this year. So some country offices, like the UN refugee presences in Jordan, as far as I could see in the data, are probably already cut down very much. And we will see next year how small certain country presences will be. And in Geneva, and I'll go into more detail into this, you have seen, if you are based in Geneva, all of the discussions for relocation, cutting down, closing offices. Here on the picture, you have the UNAIDS headquarters that is among the agencies that in the UN80 process have been proposed for complete shutdown and merging with WHO. So all of these things are on the horizon, and I want to focus on Geneva because I think this audience is particularly interested maybe on discussions in this regard. So my third future is looking a little bit at the evolution of the Geneva ecosystem. And my first premise here is that to make predictions about the future, we need to understand that the UN system headquarters, so the headquarters of different UN agencies, are already globally distributed today, right? And this is really important. We are not living in a UN world where New York and Geneva are the only headquarter locations. We have obviously the established ones like Nairobi, like Vienna. We have the emerging ones like Bonn, Copenhagen, Bangkok. And so Geneva is obviously part of a larger system of headquarters. And so my second part of this premise is that each of the headquarter locations fulfills different local ecosystem functions for the type of organizations that are there, for the type of member states, missions that are there, the experts that are coming to town. But also this entire network is an ecosystem of headquarters that tries to steer country operations, global knowledge collection, administration. And so you should always see, when you see the Geneva local ecosystem, you should also think of what's the broader headquarter ecosystem around the world and why certain headquarters function as the headquarters and the cities they are. And so my observation until today, and this is part of this year's developments, I think Geneva is already operating in a shrinking niche today. And so the question is, how will this evolve in the future? Now, when I speak of ecosystem, I like to refer to Émilie Dayrons and Fanny Badash's 21 article, Understanding International Organizations Headquarters as Ecosystems, where they focus on Geneva. I think both of them are based in Geneva, one as an academic and one for the International Trade Center. And their argument is basically that the physical proximity in Geneva matters for the ecosystem, but also the mix of multilateral missions, of international organizations, of experts coming to town, but also that Geneva as an ecosystem has a certain rhythm of working that's specific to the UN ecosystem in Geneva. It has obviously certain topics that are in focus in Geneva, and an ecosystem always depends on not just an individual organization, but on the interactions of the parts. And so what we observe this year, I think this shrinking niche of this ecosystem may affect the way this ecological cooperative framework will evolve in the next years. So for those of you who don't follow the details, just some examples. The Human Rights Office is headquartered, obviously, the UN Human Rights Office in Geneva. And in the current discussion about the regular UN budget for next year, 130 regular budget jobs are proposed to be cut in that office. This is not counting voluntary funded positions in the office. Already this year, we have seen 1/3 of meetings of the UN rights bodies being cut in Geneva, which means less experts are coming to town. They are not populating the ecosystem as before. Meetings, receptions go away, which means that interactions in the ecosystem are already changing and have already changed this year. UNICEF last week or 2 weeks ago announced to cut 300 out of 400 jobs that they still have based in Geneva and to move them out of town. The World Health Organization in the briefing earlier this week announced that more than 800 headquarter positions will be cut from the World Health Organization, which is both funded by core and voluntary contributions. So WHO has a regular budget that's adopted, but also is dependent to 70–80% on voluntary funding. And 800 positions in Geneva. They also have a smaller global service center in Malaysia. So this 800 figure is for both of those locations, but Geneva is the main part, will be cut according to the latest predictions of the funding that they will get voluntarily and in the core budget. UNAIDS has already announced earlier this year that they will cut out of 127 jobs, they will only leave 19 in Geneva. So that's basically a tiny presence in town. And UNHCR, the refugee agency, and IOM, the International Organization for Migration, depending on different sources that I tried to gather, I think they are at least cutting 200 to 250 jobs each in Geneva, maybe more, because also those two agencies are almost 100% dependent on voluntary funding. So all of these figures actually depend on, will the US pay anything next year? Will donors like the EU, like Germany, like the UK jump in? Germany is already cutting the humanitarian budget for 25, not raising it for 26. So the chances are high that maybe even the fundraising goals of this agency will not be achieved next year. And so my prediction of the future is that Geneva's role in the UN system will continue to shrink in 26 and beyond, especially because it is so dependent on voluntary funded work. Even the headquarter work that they are doing is heavily dependent on voluntary funding, and we are not in a situation where major donors will jump in very much. I think there is a risk because of this that it will lose some of its core ecosystem functions, and that this could evolve into a downward spiral because, in 1 year you have less meetings. Next year, people decide if there's nothing going on, maybe we are not coming to town. So there could be, a runaway crisis if there is no activities done against that downward spiral. And maybe something that's out of the attention, but I think given the lack of US investment in the work that's done in Geneva, World Health Organization, migration, international Geneva will be very dependent on EU member states and EU level politics in the next years, including decisions on budgets for humanitarian and development and human rights work. And the EU will negotiate its new 7-year financial framework, 2028 to 2034, in the next 1 or 2 years. And this budget will be quite important for the future of international Geneva. So I'm coming to an end of my presentation. I think I could have done many more futures and many more predictions and many more arguments of what's going to happen, and especially thinking about the disruptions that we are seeing in global politics again and again, and how they affect the UN system. You know, the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, decolonization, the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine, all of those have affected the way the UN system works or doesn't work. And so, you know, if I would make predictions about future global disruptions, I would also have other ideas about how the UN system might look like. And, you know, just to put a few on the table without going into them, you know, what will happen if China goes to war against Taiwan? What happens if the EU's member states change the way they see the EU? You know, what is with the rise of new powers and how they want to shape the UN system? How will the UN look like in a post-Trump era? You know, and whatever a post-Trump era means actually for the US. And obviously there is the rise of AI, of new technologies. You know, how will this change the way multilateral knowledge gathering work will evolve? This will be something, you know, I could have spent separate presentations on each of these, but I'm not going to do this. But if you want to dive into some of those in the questions, I'm happy to answer, or at least give my thoughts. So this is the time to hand over the questions to you. If you're not going to ask a question here, or if you're not going to get an answer here, please contact me on LinkedIn, write me messages, as many people have been doing in the last month, and I'm happy to respond in my time to anything I can answer later on. Thank you for your attention, and thank you, Isabel, for having me at SwissFuture.
Thank you very much, Ronny. I think that we would want to open for questions. And so I see that we have already one question. So if you want to ask a question, you can either put it in the chat, or you could also raise your hand and ask a question. So first question for you, Ronny, from Angelica: what is the role of private donors like rich tech giant Microsoft, Google, etc.?
Well, I think the most famous big donor of UN system activities has been the Gates Foundation, financing the work of the World Health Organization. And in terms of scale, this outshines any other influence funding of private money in the UN system. So anything else is orders of magnitude behind. So there is relatively seen very little, you know, big tech financing in the UN system. But what past research has shown, that often even minor contributions, like MasterCard, for example, supporting the World Food Program, can get a lot of visibility and a lot of relevance, let's say, in the work of the organization. You know, at times when UN funding shifted to cash delivery instead of food delivery, for example, having this, you know, the credit card type cards to make accessible cash donations to refugees and people in need. If you're working with a global tech giant, obviously even a small investment in the cards, you know, can be useful for a big tech giant. I think we should be hesitant in asking them to jump in, because obviously, you know, do we want a tech giant from the US, from China, from India influence, you know, the future of global governance? And how does the US, you know, look at a Chinese tech giant financing the UN? How does a Chinese government look at the US tech giant finance? So whenever you think of private financing of the UN activities, you should always think of the underlying geopolitics that come with it. So more financing means more politicization of this financing. Interestingly, and to finish this answer, the League of Nations Health Organization was already dependent on US philanthropic support at times when the US was not even a member of the League of Nations. So there's also always some continuity across time that I would like to highlight here again on this example, on this question.
Thank you very much. And a question from one of the graduate institute students, Bronwyn, who is there. Is network multilateralism a kind of way of saying the emergence of regional blocks in the UN system? Is saying that there is an emergence, yeah.
Yeah, I think there is no doubt that there is already an emergence of regional blocks. So this is the case, although let's say there's a difference between obviously the EU as a regional bloc and the African region or the Asian region with large, let's say, geopolitical powers and players being there. So I think this is also the idea of networked multilateralism, because whether we get cohesive regions or whether alliances like the BRICS, that actually bridge regions, or South cooperation, as it's called in the UN system now, all of these things are layered on top of each other, and maybe the UN's core is the only place where they all meet, or a functioning core could function as a platform where they all meet. And because in the end, for certain questions, we may still have to get inter-regional agreements or inter-alliance agreements that cannot be solved within those regional or inter-regional clusters.
And perhaps if I may build on that question, and perhaps useful for everyone, of one thing that was for me in reading you a great insight is really coming back a little bit on the funding architecture of different organizations, because in the development sector or in the human rights, the funding architecture is very different. And I think in the human rights, it allows for relocations in Europe because the funding is European. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yes. So as I said in the presentation, about 20% of the entire UN system is funded by regular budgets, and they look like, similar to what you would see at national level. There is a budget proposal, then member states discuss the proposal and they adopt it. Then it's valid for 1 year, like the regular UN budget or the peacekeeping budget, or it's valid 2 years, like the WHO or the ILO budget. But this funding only makes up 20% of the overall funding. So certain things are financed by these regular budget, everything on top, and the majority of humanitarian and development aid through the UN system is voluntary funded. On top of being voluntary, so a government says, I have to pay 100 million for my regular budget contribution, but I want to add another 100 million. Half of it is for development, half of it is for humanitarian aid, but they don't just give the money. This money is earmarked into usually projects or programs. So it means that the German government doesn't give UNHCR 50 million and says, do what you want, whatever you see fit. But they give one project of 5 million for gender-based violence in Sudan and ask UNHCR to implement it. Which means that the project, next year, if the German government priorities shift, they could say, we don't do gender-based violence, we do male economic development in Kenya, right? And I'm saying this because the German government yesterday announced that they will restructure the foreign ministry to get rid of the entire humanitarian division and link this closer to country-level diplomacy. So, those things can happen, and which means that there is a lot of the UN funding is actually what we call multi-bilateral aid. So it's a way of channeling bilateral financing through multilateral channels. And in an ideal world, we would say the money lands in those agencies, and then there's some collective multilateral decision making. But that's not how most of the funding actually works. And this is what you said, Isabel. Any of the voluntary funding, especially the earmarked one, can be redirected from one year to the other, or as Trump did, they had projects promised and financed for the International Organization for Migration, but they just cut them. They just said, we will not pay out the money. So people who were hired on projects had to be let go from one day to the other because the money was actually not there.
Mm-hmm. But we also have some different construct that is in development or perhaps in humanitarian aid. You will have also donors from the global north and perhaps the global majority or global south, whereas in humanitarian rights, it's less the case, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, I mean...
and other, fine, then health, or we could talk of different...
Yeah, most of the voluntary funding is and was provided by wider community of global north donors, added maybe in recent years with Gulf donors and Arab donors, but often also very specifically earmarked for certain purposes in the region. And the system was very much dependent on this continued US funding, which means that also a lot of the core structures that, in humanitarian development aid delivery were based on expectations that there would be this kind of baseline voluntary support. And so the EU and others would, give on top. But now the underlying core structures are actually under threat. In human rights work, it's even more dependent on EU donors. I looked at the latest statistics of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights earlier yesterday. And I think of the donors that have donated until end of October, the EU, the Brussels EU, is the highest donor, voluntary donor to the High Commissioner's office this year. So that's why I also was saying that EU budget negotiations, especially the long-term ones, will be quite important for the Geneva and the human rights system, obviously.
Thank you. Does anyone have another question? Are there perhaps people raising their hands that I don't see?
I see a question by Abigail, I think.
Yes, now it's coming. Yeah. So do you think the UNAIDS adequately addresses the political drivers behind the crisis? Concerning the futures you generated, which indicators should researchers monitor over the next 12 to 18 months to foresee which scenario is unfolding? Very good question.
So yeah, on the first one, no, I don't think the UNAIDS is addressing the political realities for a simple and maybe simplified reason. So I simplify a little bit the state of affairs, but this was a process started by the UN Secretary General as the US cuts came in. And it's basically a process of organizational efficiency gains, of cutting down what can be cut down, of merging what's easy to merge. But already when we talk about merging UN agencies, the question is, what are the political interests behind the existence of separate agencies? And a good example is the merger of UN Women and UNFPA. Obviously, anybody who says, wouldn't it be great to have a single gender-oriented global UN agency doing everything under one roof, forcefully with money and energy? Wouldn't that be great, right? But whenever you merge something, you're basically making decisions of a new kind, right? And so the question is, do sexual and reproductive rights oriented programs of UNFPA survive a merger, because then you reopen the packages that have been negotiated over years and decades, or are those who propose the merger actually hoping to let this topic fall off the cliff? And so the second question is it actually saving money? So those who have a political interest in saving money will they actually profit from a merger, or are you just, adding up costs in a new joint organization, right? And the underlying bigger questions, the geopolitics, are not addressed at all, right? What I always ask the question, what kind of UN would China and Russia like to see if they were free to decide this today, right? And I think those questions are not at all addressed in these things. They are at best hidden behind the closed doors negotiations. China, for example, has become the second largest core contributor to the UN system this year. So the US is now at 22%, or has been for a while, because that's the cap. And China has reached 20% this year. But this means also China is much more interested in cutting funding to the UN system, but obviously it has also very clear interests where to cut and where not to cut. It works very closely with the G77 and China, which is a singular group, in UN budget negotiations in New York. But to my observation, it might even act against the geopolitical interests of the rest of the G77 by asking for cuts and efficiencies that actually might hit development work or staff from global South countries. But the G77 and China still work together very closely. So no, the politics are not addressed enough, for sure. On the indicators, I think the hardest thing to observe is what kind of core functionalities of the system are destroyed, are not sustained right now. And I say this, the system is reducing by 15, 20, 30, 40%, depending on the agency. And you cannot cut this far with just efficiency gains. You have to cut activities, you have to prioritize. If it's not officially decided, it has to happen behind the scenes, right? And so maybe some of the logistics chains that have been built by the World Food Programme, by UNHCR, are affected. And so if there's a future crisis in parts of the world, they will not be as efficient or more expensive in responding. It's also very hard to see how all of the agencies are cutting in different places. So, are they all deciding to cut down Jordan, but Syria is still supported? Or is one government financing World Health Organization in Syria and UNHCR in Jordan? And so there's still a kind of balanced presence in the region. Those kind of figures will only be published, that's why I wrote this or said this in my presentation. Those figures are only published later next year. For the cuts of 26, they will only be published in 27. So getting a feeling of how large and small certain locations will get and what this means for regional and local activities of the UN, this will be really important.
Thank you very much. Do we have perhaps some more questions?
Can I have a question? Yes, thank you very much, Ronny. The geopolitical dimension I'm very interested in, and put them in a global perspective of shifts. I think we have to be clear that the core financing of the UN, you mentioned China, but the rest, half of the budget is Western countries, and they are losing geopolitical influence. We have this discrepancy between the global South and the Western world, and maybe I'm wrong, but as far as I understand, most of these UN institutions are kind of Western institutions, and we see now a change in world order. It's not an order by rule, it's order by interests. We have a very different worldview from the global South to the Western South, to the Western world. The global South says Western world has a double standard. They are asking things from us what they don't even do themselves. And then we also have this big debt crisis in many countries. Regarding all these big shifts, demographic shifts, we could add. How does that influence the future of these international organizations?
Yes, so some of the phenomena that you describe they look new, but I think they have just been overshadowed by a more calm or more balanced period of the 2000s, late 90s, early 2010s. I'm saying this because obviously the global south, or as it was called, the third world at the time versus US interests was already big, in the past. So some of those things are actually continuities. I think what's shifting is the actual geopolitical, economic, and military power balances, right? That underpin those conflicts. And what's also problematic right now, I think, and I said this before we started the presentation in the pre-conversation, I think we are at the moment in history where a lot of big powers, smaller powers, and groups of countries, they know what they don't want in the global order, but they don't really know what they want in a new global order, except maybe more influence, right? That's that's the obvious part of it. But take, for example, the Security Council, right? There's obvious, it's obvious not made for 2025. Everybody agrees to this, except the P5 in a way, right? The permanent 5 members. But those P5, some of them might want to change the global order, but it might also mean to build an order without the Security Council that they have now under their control, right? So giving up the old order actually means also a loss of established power and influence. So this is why I think what we're going to see more and more, and we see this with China, for example, last year or the year before, I don't know the timeline anymore, they created the International Organization for Mediation. I don't know whether you've seen this. That basically sounds like, a way of having an alternative, not so invasive, peace discussion forum that isn't as powerful as the Security Council. You never know whether those fora will actually grow to a big enough size to work. But a good example is the International Renewable Energy Agency that was created in Abu Dhabi, I think, in the United Arab Emirates and Germany. It started as a small international agency, and now it has almost complete membership. So, new places in the world and new technologies in this case find their new organizational structures. And the question will be, are those the places where the current growing powers are happy with their influence or not, right? Or they try to build something, they realize it's the same dynamics as before, and they leave them aside afterwards. So I think we are, I hate to make those kind of predictions, but I think we are in a 10-year period, where a lot of ideas and will pop up, and the question is which one will evolutionary survive. I still believe that the UN at the core is the strongest evolutionary, structure, but maybe there will be something that grows on the side.
Thank you very much. And I think perhaps we can finish on 2 questions that both address the global majority or global south. Some of the things you've been addressing already, but I think there's a point that Isabel is making, which is quite interesting. Is this geopolitical turmoil a window of opportunity for the global south, for instance, the BRICS, to reshape the negotiation table in order to reform the overall UN system? But what would be their leverage is also perhaps the good question to ask indeed. And I go on with Marilyn. Do you see China increasingly taking over the US role as a major donor? And if so, what implications would that have for how the UN is viewed by global South powers?
Let me start with the second question on China. So far, it has not taken on the same role as the other donors. It's a very tiny donor of voluntary contributions in relative terms. So I think last year, at least the year before, the EU gave voluntarily more than China gave in total based on obligatory and voluntary contributions. So the EU, not counting the member states on top of that, just the EU in Brussels gave more than China. And for me, this is a signal so far that China probably, I'm not a China expert, so I leave this to the experts to decide, probably prefers bilateral humanitarian and development support. It probably prefers the development banks it is setting up together with other countries. And I'm not sure they will become a major voluntary donor because it doesn't buy them influence that's more than what they have in bilateral affairs. And so I think it's rather that Western countries will decline their multilateral aid in this way and do it more bilateral like China does, than China jumping into the multilateral system. But that's a non-China expert speaking. On the global south, I think their biggest leverage in the current international organizational structure is twofold. A, they have a 2/3 majority in the General Assembly and in all assemblies of the specialized agencies. Well, except ILO in a way because of the tripartite structure that it has. But even there, if you count the employers and trade unions from the region. So in a way, there is no decision being made formally on anything against the global south. And this is why I think they should have the biggest interest, the G77, to have a functioning core UN system that keeps the major powers happy enough to pay, because without money, you're not doing anything. But I think the global south does not need to build new institutions to be influential. I think the G77, to my understanding, is not the most effective structure of coordinating the global south and leveraging its joint power. And I think that's the problem. I think, for example, in UN budget negotiations right now, China basically takes the lead as far as I can observe as an outsider. While, if Brazil, India, the other BRICS, would join together in the G77 and push for their ideas, maybe they could, leverage much more. And I think that's the second leverage. There's obviously a worry in part of the global north of the rise of China or the influence of China, whether this is right or wrong, this view, but it's there. And the global south, could play, that game of saying, global north, you want us to be less on the Chinese interest side and more on our interest side? Give us money for our interests, provide support for the type of development that we want the UN to do. This is costly, but we have the majority, you have the money, or you want to put the money on the table, so do it. So I think that is the leverage that the global south has. I think in the midterm, the countries of the global south that are economically and population-wise large and militarily also powerful, I think they will have to take over also more active responsibilities in guiding, in financing the system if they want to shape it. And I think this means to go behind some of the established routines of saying we are the developing world, and thus the developed world has to pay. But I think the shift to we are the emerging, powers, and we want to have emerging power rhetoric has to be then mixed with financial and political influence. That's the leverage I think they have, but I'm afraid they are not there yet in the coordination to get there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ronny Patz, for your insight. Thank you for this very intensive lecture and answers to questions. I think for me it will be like probably for others very interesting to be able to see the video in January posted on our website. Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who took part to this lecture. And we are happy as Swiss Future to meet you back next year with some more lectures. And again, thank you very much, Ronny. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.